Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
This week on the Hollywood in Toto podcast, a country songwriter says what we're all afraid to say in our woke age. We cheer on a comedian who shames his peers in epic fashion. Just wait till you hear it. And we speak with Josh Denny, who has far more in common with Lenny Bruce than, I'd say 99% of comedians working today. You're going to see why soon enough. I want to start with musicians, though. When did musicians stop being cool? Listen, I don't like it when they trash hotel rooms, when they show up to a gig 3 or 4 hours late. Not cool at all, honestly. And when they're dating women on the border between legal and illegal, again, just kind of gross. I'm all for progress on these fronts. I think we've seen it across the musical landscape. Good. But, musicians used to ooze cool. They blazed their own trail. They defied authority. And along the way, they made us a little cooler, maybe by osmosis. Listen, I get it. The older I get, the more I realize that some of this was just a pose, a shtick, a marketing gimmick aimed at gullible fans like me. All right, I'm older and wiser. Still, rock meant something more than 3 chords and the truth. It was something that made us a little uneasy, maybe a little nervous. Is there anything out there in the music scene today that does something like that? Now, there are a few exceptions. Love Tom McDonald. His anti-rock raps are just amazing. His videos are even better. And I could even point to a former Hitcast guest, 5 Times August. He writes some killer protest songs, the kind we really need. Well, now there's Win Varble. Now, I may be like you. I didn't know that name until recently. I did do a little Google searching. Turns out he's a really big name in country music. He's written some big songs for big artists. Remember Darryl Worley's song, Have You Forgotten? Powerful stuff. Yeah, Varble wrote that. But now he's penned a new song that speaks directly to what we're going through in our woke age. It's called I'm Just Saying, and it goes a little something like this.
They've torn Portland all to pieces and let Chicago go to hell. There's people leaving New York City like they rang the fire bell. They call themselves enlightened, but cancel those who don't agree. I wish all these folks who claim their role would just go back to sleep. I'm just saying, have we all lost our minds? I'm just saying, where do we draw a line? I know y'all think it takes balls to be singing what I'm singing, but I'm just saying what you're thinking.
That's Austin Moody behind the mic, sharing thoughts that are both eloquent and darn near essential. How far have we fallen as a Western culture that we're afraid to speak our minds or even sing our minds these days? Even singing a song like this is risking something powerful, some blowback. So wouldn't it be terrible if that song went viral? Come on, let's make that happen. I want more singers to be talking about this, to be singing about this, to be sharing information like this. More rockers should be out there talking about the crippling attacks on free speech. We reported a few weeks ago about how Kiss's Paul Stanley was taking a stand against gender affirmation surgery for preteens. And of course, a few days later, once the show went live, he backpedaled like Lance Armstrong. Cowards, not rockers. Sad, but true. We did have some brave singers during the pandemic. Eric Clapton and Van Morrison. Who expected that? They united, they made some music, they spoke out against the lockdowns, and they were absolutely pummeled by the press for their positions. I remember Rolling Stone dug up a decades-old situation with Eric Clapton, insinuating he was a racist. Now, would they have done that? Would they have resurfaced that little bit of trivia if he hadn't made those anti-lockdown songs? Of course not. By the way, where's their apology? It's not coming, but I'm really glad they stood tall, and I bet you they are too. It was a terrible time. We needed someone to sing for us, and they did just that. For now, the anti-woke mob, and I include myself as a card-carrying member of that one, has an anthem all our own. And I'm just saying, it's about time. The current comedy scene makes me want to hurl, to paraphrase the great Garth from Wayne's World. Clapter, endlessly partisan jokes, gags that just aren't funny at all, and that's just the late night scene. What really got under my skin, though, is when comedians stood down during the pandemic. Yeah, I can't forgive and forget the pandemic, nor should anyone else out there. Remember Saturday Night Live? They were acting like Dr. Anthony Fauci's press secretary. Ah, just disgusting. And if you have a strong stomach, and only if, Google Stephen Colbert, the vax scene. You'll know what I'm talking about. Oh, man. Jimmy Dore, though, well, he's noticed what's going on in comedy, and he's got something to say about it. Now, Dore is a liberal comedian and podcaster. He's been labeled a conspiracy theorist. There's some truth there, too. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's a truth teller to a certain degree. I'll give him that. But he's been railing against state-controlled comedy. My term, not his, but certainly applicable. Now, Dan Bongino, the great Dan Bongino, played a clip from Jimmy Dore recently. It was a stand-up routine. I don't have a date on it. It was in a recent Dan Bongino episode, but I wanted to give Dan that hat tip, but I also wanted to play that segment here. It's that good. Check it out.
The weird thing that happened around COVID, I'd never noticed this before in any other time in my life, but you weren't allowed to ask questions at any point during this. You just had to do what the man on the TV said, right? You had to do what the man on the TV said without questions, and then you're a good person. But if you question it, then you're a white supremacist Trumper. Not, I'm like, whoa, no. No, I didn't vote for Trump. I just have questions. Jimmy, only dumb people ask questions. No, I'm pretty sure we're supposed to question authority. It's like a value. Is that what they taught you in comedy school? Yeah, that is what they taught me in comedy school. Isn't that weird? It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Even comedians would get on stage and they would shame people for trying to get informed about a medical treatment that was experimental that they had to take or they would lose their jobs and they wouldn't be able to travel. And when people tried to get informed about that, other people shamed them. They would say, please tell me you're not going to do your own research. You've heard people say that. Please don't do your own research. You know, before COVID, doing your own research used to be called reading. Now you're shaming me for reading? At the behest of Big Pharma? It's like I woke up in the middle of a Bill Hicks bit. Well, looks like we got ourselves a reader.
I don't know what I can add to that. That's just soak in its goodness. It is wonderful. I think you can say Lenny Bruce died for our comedy sins. Fair? Unfair? You be the judge. Of course, he came of age in the 50s and 60s, and he reinvented what stand-up meant at the time, and of course, the reverberations are felt today. Comedians can say what they want about the culture, politics, war, peace, you name it. I mean, to a degree, we've got cancel culture, but they did. The whole art form opened up after Lenny Bruce and, of course, later George Carlin. Absolute innovators. Now, Bruce had a potty mouth, no doubt, and he also didn't like authority, and that's what got him into some really serious trouble. Got arrested again, more legal fights, just an absolute disaster. And, of course, he was dabbling in drugs at the time, and he died in 1966 of a drug overdose. You could say it's the fallout from his personal demons. I would say that just battling back for the sake of speaking his mind, I think that played a pretty significant role in his death, too. Now, our next guest has not faced those consequences. He hasn't been in jail, hasn't been on trial. But his fight to tell his jokes his way, there's an eerie similarity between what he's doing now and what Lenny Bruce suffered. And the fact that it's happening is crazy. Though Josh Denny has been canceled a couple times, but right now he's not trying to go mainstream. He just wants to go out on the road, go tour with his friends, Anthony Cumia from Opie and Anthony, obviously, and Gavin McInnes, one of the most canceled people on the planet. Now, if you think Josh and his friends are funny, you buy a ticket. If you like Jim Gaffigan or dry bar comedy, clean G-rated humor, well, then you avoid Josh Denny's tour. That's fine. It's easy peasy. If only it were that simple. Tucker Carlson, of course, booted off of Fox News without reason. He was one of the few mainstream journalists to bring up Josh Denny's story. And that's one of the many, many reasons why we miss Tucker Carlson and can't wait till he's back in a more full-time capacity. If it's on Twitter, who knows, but we need him back. But I digress only slightly. Listen to him describe how the woke mob shut down one of Josh Denny's shows. It is really amazing.
Earlier this month, Denny was preparing to host a comedy show in Rutherford, New Jersey. That's about a half hour outside of New York. But just minutes after the show was announced, Antifa, a violent radical group, decided to shut it down. Hundreds of Antifa-affiliated Twitter accounts started bombarding the venue, called the Williams Center. They also went after the chief of police of Rutherford, a man called John Russo, and they threatened violence. Now, at that point, a chief of police who wanted to defend the Constitution, his solemn duty, would have pushed back and affirmed the sacred right of free expression of every American. But that's not what Chief Russo did. Instead, he caved to the demands of the mob. He warned the venue that the venue might face civil liability if they let free speech continue, if they allowed the show to go on. Then he said he would shut down the show on, quote, public safety grounds. So ultimately, the Williams Center had no choice and canceled the show. In the end, the only people who showed up at the Williams Center that night were several police officers, and they were there to make sure there was no comedy taking place, none at all.
Now, that wasn't an isolated case. It happened again and again in cities like New York and Chicago. If you want to see Josh Denny, you got to follow him on social media, or they get sort of connected with him electronically, and he will let you know where he's playing in a given city closer to the date of the show. That way, Antifa can't rally, pressure the venue to stop it from happening. Isn't that amazing? This is America in 2023. This is not the Lenny Bruce years. So why isn't Josh Denny's story splashed across every news center in the world? At least the country. It just makes me sick. Now, I spoke with Josh about his current tour, dubbed End Racism. And you know what? He's funny. He's also smart. He's provocative. He's thoughtful. And he's willing to push buttons to make us question our beliefs. I love that. That's what Dave Chappelle does. In short, Josh Denny is a comedian. He's one of the bravest ones around, period. You know what? I'm not that brave, but I am absolutely proud to have him back on the show. I wanted to start with a sense of the comedy culture right now. I feel like we've had some positive signs. Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan really did survive cancel culture attacks that were pretty significant. But then, of course, you can't play a gig without jumping through a lot of hoops, and which we'll talk about in a minute. Good things, bad things, scary things, progress. Where do you see comedy in the culture right now? Is it getting better? Is it worse? Is it sort of somewhere in between? What's your sense of things? Because you're out the road, you're doing this right now.
Yeah, I think it's fractured. I think there's a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, and people kind of fall into these, categories. Like, I think you look at guys like Chappelle and Rogan, and I think we can all agree they probably have enough money at this point where they're kind of untouchable. And then I think below that, you've kind of got two different categories, maybe more, but two primary categories where you have people that are kind of acting from a place of cowardice, where there's the way the industry is always run, and they want to continue to work within the confines of that. So they will sacrifice any personal opinions or discomfort, anything that they sort of disagree with. And you saw this with mandatory vaccinations for comedy clubs, which happened during the pandemic for comedians. Like, I think Sam Tripoli said, you can do coke in the green room, but make sure you have a card, like at the comedy store. It's kind of absurd.
How dare you, sir?
But you've got that half, and then you've got kind of the renegades of comedy, which are sort of a throwback to the Lenny Bruces of this modern time, Lenny Bruce back then. And then you've got some people the modern time who are just going, listen, we're not going to work within the confines of that business anymore. We're not going to work with managers who play ball with companies that don't, have the artistic vision front and center. We're not going to work with comedy clubs that don't honor free speech. We're not going to work with any of these places that try to censor us. And we're not going to capitulate to mobs. And that's kind of what we're doing with the tour I'm on now, with the End Racism Tour. When I was canceled in 2018 and through the difficulty through the pandemic and everything else, instead of trying to work through booking agents, I just decided to start my own company. And so, with my background in business negotiations and everything else, with some of the different hats I've worn before I jumped into comedy and entertaining full time in 2013, I thought, well, I had to have gone through that stuff for a reason and acquired those skills for a reason, and maybe it's for this. So I just took the bull by the horns and started brokering my own deals, building our own tours, doing our own marketing, putting the lineup together. It happened I met Gavin McInnes and Anthony Cumia while this was all kind of happening. So everything just sort of fell into place. And they're two like-minded individuals, along with our producer, Ryan, who, still believe that, comedy can come from anywhere. It can offend or, placate what people think equally, and it should have the freedom to do so. And so, our tours have been centered around that, of like a sort of an homage to what comedy was and why we all wanted to do it in one form or another to begin with. And we're trying to take it back to that place.
What's been the reaction from the crowds? Obviously, you guys are funny. That's a given. But I would think there's something more going on with the kind of jokes you're telling, with the kind of approach you're taking to the situation. What has been some of the reactions? Maybe something different than a typical, oh, I thought he was funny and I enjoyed my experience at the comedy club.
Gratitude, like people come up to us and they don't go like, hey, great jokes, or I love that. Like early in my career, I loved it when I got feedback on specific jokes, and that still happens sometimes. But most of what people come up to us and say after shows with the handshake or the hug is, thank you for doing this. Like this feels like it almost, in a weird way, we feel like an underground railroad for uncensored laughs. Like people come up to us and they're like, listen, you're saving lives out here. You know what I mean? Like they really appreciate that somebody is willing to stick their neck out there and still try to do this kind of stuff in a time where it's not easy. But what worth doing has ever been easy,
It's amazing that we, for years and years, would revere Lenny Bruce and tell his story over again. And to a lesser extent, George Carlin, people who really suffered for telling jokes and went to jail and suffered. Lenny Bruce's whole life just collapsed because of the battles he had. I don't think they get name checked anymore. I think they're we're trying to forget them. And I obviously what you're going through and your peers, it's different. It's not the same. You're not in jail. You're not calling from a prison. But there are similarities. What do you think about the connection between the work you're doing and what they did back then?
It's funny that you say that, because I kind of grew up in comedy hating Lenny Bruce, and more so hating the comics who always invoked his name. I always thought Lenny was very verbose. Mm-hmm. And I've learned very early in comedy, because I was verbose, and I realized, hey, this isn't working. And, I can't remember where I heard this at the very beginning, but somebody talked to me about the importance of an economy of language, of saying, like, if you can get the funny across in fewer words, do that, because the simpler you can break a concept down. It's like mathematics. There are people who can do calculus, but there are way more people who can add 2 + 2. So if you can boil it down to the simplest way, shortest way, you're going to be able to hit the most people with it. And you can do that with complex ideas too, if you take the extra time to really simplify them. And I always thought like Lenny was the calculus of comedy, like getting into this long, sort of drawn out conceptual ideas and thoughts, or even stories. And what's so funny is all the guys that used to rave about Lenny Bruce at open mics when I first started don't have an ounce of his courage. And I find myself looking at him completely differently now than I did when I first started in comedy, because what he did was so important. And whether he was what I think is the best comedian of all time, I think that honor belongs to Dave Attell in terms of raw talent and funny. But when you talk about whether or not I think he was the funniest, he's probably the most important. And that's where I give like credit to him and Carlin. I think they were the most important comedians, because they sort of Lenny established, sort of the idea of, I'm going to do this whether you like it or not, and you can't stop me. And I think George kind of took that to the next level and said, I'm going to tell you things you don't want to hear, and I'm going to make you laugh while I do it.
Yeah.
And I think it was a little bit more I think George set out with a little bit more intentionality behind the way he did his act and the things he put together. Whereas I felt like Lenny, if you look back and listen to his stuff, very stream of consciousness.
But you couldn't do the things we're doing today without those building blocks, without the pioneers going through those steps, exploring, trying new things. One of the things I've heard over the years.
They made personal sacrifices to do it.
Sure.
I mean, their lives were not great and easy. I mean, Carlin, if you look back on his life, and as much as I don't like Judd Apatow, he did a great documentary on George Carlin. He struggled like up until the end. Like it really was until the end that he did his best work and made the most money. Most of his life with his children growing up and stuff, or his daughter growing up, was very tough. Like living like, most of us live now, sort of paycheck to paycheck, gig to gig, traveling all over the country and just grinding it out.
Yeah, there was a great documentary, by the way, and I'm not Apatow. I have mixed feelings about. He blocked me on Twitter years ago. I still don't know why. One of the things I want to ask is that
you were being yourself.
That's I don't throw many sharp elbows on Twitter, but maybe he begs to disagree.
They frown upon that, Christian. You don't know?
Exactly. Now, given all that's going on right now, and you've been at this for a while, obviously, you're not a 19-year-old kid. How has your act changed over the years? Do you have to address these issues, or do you just do what you do, and then the clerical work of being a comedian, being outrageous in a way, or being rebellious, takes on a different character? How do you kind of marry the two?
I think I was kind of bad at it in the beginning because I was a little bit defensive with the way things happened with me. So I think I started out kind of leading people through it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to understand, and I feel like this is where Gavin McInnes has really been an influence on me, is I started to understand that, like, by explaining it, you're kind of ruining it.
It's like Lenny Bruce reading the court transcripts, right? I mean, it's not...
Yeah, exactly. So in a weird way, it's like you kind of just got to hit them with it, and they either come along for the ride or they don't. We just did 2 shows in LA on April Fool's Day. And I had a friend that I've known for 10 years come out. She's a nurse, and she brought 3 friends with her that had no idea who we were and what we did. And 2 of them left halfway through my set. And so, but then she stayed and one of her other friends stayed. So we batted about 500 on that one. But you kind of have to understand that is part of that is that not everyone's going to like it, but there is a real... And even listening to the audio or watching the footage back from show 1 to show 2, where your material is a little bit tighter in the second show, just hitting the audience with the concepts when they're not expecting anything, the reaction was so much more. So I feel like you kind of feel that out as a comedian, and everybody's a little bit different. But for me, I think sometimes bludgeoning them over the head with the most absurd premise you have in your arsenal for the night is maybe the best way to kick things off. Gavin has this thing he says about meeting new people where he goes, I like to put my worst foot forward. And then if we can still be social after that, then it's probably going to be a great friendship. But,
right.
He goes, you'll meet somebody and they'll say something like, I hate Trump. And your inclination as a person is to not confront that because it's not polite. But he'll go, listen, I just want you to know you're talking to probably the biggest Trump supporter in the world, and I started the Proud Boys. Where do we go from here? And it's sort of this fantastic hand grenade way to socialize with people. And I think he does that on stage as well. And it's sort of inspired me comedically to try to be more like that with my acts. So like the shows, not to spoil this for people who come out, but I might start, my show with something like, I think the best part of us having transgendered school shooters is, and so immediately people are just like, oh my God, not only are we going there, but like, he thinks there's a good part, so I think when you can really just snatch that tablecloth out from under everybody while they're having their dinner, I think that's a really fun trick.
I was just going to ask you if you can share a topic or theme that you discuss on stage that does trigger that reaction. Because I haven't seen you recently, and I'm going to blame you because you have not been to Denver, I don't think, in a while. But that's an example.
Probably going to be Colorado Springs, honestly.
Okay, that's fair.
But
are there certain subjects that immediately get people's get them on edge? Obviously, trans issues, I'm sure, is key there, as if you can't go near that. But what else gets people the walkouts or people who aren't ready for it?
Well, our audience is a little bit like playing for a home field
Sure,
advantage.
sure.
Like we have home field advantage for sure. So I think in a lot of cases, when they know we're doing something that most people wouldn't like, they really kind of turn.
Mhm.
So the trans thing, while it's very popular, almost every comic on our side of the aisle is talking about that issue. So I really try to come at things almost from the angle that's sort of opposite of what I know the audience I'm performing for expects. So most people expect me to be sort of anti-trans, anti-progressive LGBTQ stuff. So I try to find a funny way not to be, to be a little bit sort of counter to what they expect. But one topic that I've touched on that I think is that kind of surprises people or evokes a certain reaction is talking about Black people's mental health issues and how absurd they must be. And so the idea behind that is, you know, if you took somebody from the 1960s who lived through one of the hardest times being a Black person in America and compared them to, you know, a Black person today calling into work because their social anxiety is out of control and their therapy dog is sick, I think you'd have a pretty significant separation of perspective.
Which is a fair
so
point.
I kind of introduced it.
And it's
I think yeah, and I think you you know, I sort of introduced it under the guise of like racism is over, everybody, and I knew that the second that Black people started calling into work with the same made up illnesses that white people do. And that kind of goes into a bigger chunk of material where I talk about the absurdity of the crutch that has become mental illness. We sort of throw it at everything, right? And everyone loves to pat Rogan on the back for the famous tweet he posted many years ago now that said we have a mental health issue in this country disguised as a gun issue. And I think the mental health issue is a disguise as well. And I think we have an issue with lack of purpose in our society today. I don't think we have a North Star. I think government wants to replace religion as that North Star. And isn't it funny that Star Wars was pretty much about that in the 70s? And yet we missed all the signs that our government was pushing in that same direction for the last 50 years.
I blame George Lucas for selling the franchise. He was onto it.
Yeah.
And he just cashed in. You know, one of the things I found.
If you think about it, the Jedi were spiritual, sort of cultural leaders, and you know they run up against big government who exterminated them. So you know it's kind of what you're seeing socially in America, and I think I'll take it one step further.
Yeah.
I think we have a lack of purpose issue disguised as a mental health issue. And I think human beings don't know where to find value in themselves anymore. They do it in victimhood. And I think mental illness became white people's thing the minute they found out they didn't have a thing.
Now, in the beginning, we talked about, before we started chatting, about some of the hoops you have to jump through. You have to, you know, hide where you're going to play and then share the information later. What else? I mean, you're a comedian, you go on tour. It should be a very simple process. What other changes or challenges do you face when you go on the road at this point?
Well, just the side I deal with the negotiation process is the most difficult I've ever experienced in my career. I mean, I've even had people tell us straight up, listen, we like your politics. We agree with everything you're doing. We just don't want the heat.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes it really, really tough to stomach, because it's sort of like, yeah, but you not wanting the heat is why we're in this position to begin with.
Yeah.
Like if people like you in these positions sacked up a little bit and showed a little bit of intestinal fortitude and you know, stood your ground on things like this, it wouldn't be like this in the first place. I don't know if you saw the interview recently with Elon Musk on CNBC, but they brought up his Magneto tweet, which was like a pretty benign joke about George Soros. And the guy's like, yeah, but why share it at all? Like people won't like it and your investors won't like it. And it's like, he's literally sitting there going like, yeah, but why do you have to be yourself in public? Can't you just hide it and do it in private? And it's like, imagine if you said that to a gay person today after everything they fought through to be themselves. And now we're telling other people, hey man, just don't be yourself. People won't like it and it's going to create problems for everybody. So it's like, in a weird way, we fought now for all this sort of progress socially, just to end up in a place where you have a guy on the media telling one of the richest, most influential people in the world, we don't have a problem if you're yourself, just like do it in private.
It's amazing, and it's such a font for humor, and it's so frustrating for me. That's a journalist speaking, and I think that person was speaking for a lot of journalists. And when I cover things like Rolling Stone magazine, which is so clearly anti-free speech at this point, it makes my head spin. But that's where we are, and that's why the work you do is so important. I understand that. I've talked to other comedians, and they say that their fellow comedians are often the harshest against them. They may be rallying the cancel culture crusade. It could be jealousy. What's been your experience? Are you finding, obviously Kumi and McGinnis are on your side, but is there a camaraderie forming with people, even if they don't agree with your political speaking? Or what's it like sort of in the network of comedians right now?
Not as much as I'd like to see, honestly. There is sort of, in a weird way, there sort of has developed this every man for himself thing. And in a weird way, it's like the Silicon Valley wars, when Gates and Jobs first got started, it was like a race, an arms race to see who could get there first. I think there's some of that. That's a problem. I was mentioning to you before we started that part of the problem with conservative ideology is that we believe in rewarding individualism, which makes us very poor collaborators. And so I think some of that is the problem. But there's so many more people. What bothers me are the number of people that will support you privately and be silent publicly. And again, it goes back to what I said about that kind of behavior is sort of why we're in this place to begin with. And not to Gino Carano myself, but that's kind of like what happened in World War II, where there were so many people who were just like, just do what they say and like everything will be fine, and then it wasn't fine. You know what I mean? And so I have like some of my peers, they don't do this anymore, but when I sort of first started making this turn in my career, or I should say had to, because I was just sort of being myself and the industry went the other way, where they just sort of stopped letting you be that way. I had a lot of people sort of like pull me aside and go like, hey man, like I know what you're saying, and listen, I agree with you, but like, just don't put it out there. And I just that went against everything in my soul of like what felt like the right thing to do, and I sort of saw the writing on the wall of like, the more we do this, the harder it will be to be anything other than what is approved. And that can change overnight.
And once you taste that freedom, it's hard to go back and be buttoned down. It'd be like George Carlin, shaving his beard and getting back into the three-piece suit that he did at the beginning of his career. Have you had any debates with people who just disagree with your approach? And I'm kind of curious if they've had any comments or any critiques of you that you thought actually had merit.
Yeah, I mean, even my own partner in my life has been critical of that at times, and has said like, does everything have to be a battle? Like, does everything, And I've had friends too, like they'll catch the collateral damage of their affiliation with me from people they work with. And the tough thing is, I think the toughest part of it is, meeting new people. So like, my significant other will get a new job and she'll go work with new people. And inevitably what comes up is like, hey, what does your, husband or boyfriend or whatever do for work?
He's an accountant.
And
Why?
then, yeah. So we live in a time where, if she just goes, he's a comedian, and they go, what's his name? Then they can just type it into a little box in their hand and make a million assumptions based on a few headlines, which doesn't necessarily include context or character or depth or anything involved in any of those sound bites. So it's like the fact that people can sort of quickly misdiagnose you just based off of a few things on the internet makes it tough. And then everyone in your life has to carry the burden of how easy it is for people to do that too.
Yeah.
And so it's tricky. And I understand why why so many people just don't do that. There's so many people aren't wired that way. Listen, if every human being was wired like I was wired, there would have never been a genocide in the history of human civilization. So those horrible things happen throughout history, or have happened throughout history, because large swaths of people don't have the courage to take any action against it.
Yeah.
And so I don't say that to put myself on a pedestal, because it feels more burdensome some days. Like by the way, I wish I was content being plugged into the Matrix. And, it's like that scene in the Matrix when Cypher's like, I know this is all fake, but this ignorance is bliss. I wish I could live in the Matrix and be happy. I'm just not wired that way. And so I think the best thing I can do is just be on the front lines as much as possible and fight the battles that I think are really important. Try to surround myself with people that are like that. I think that's why Gavin and Anthony and I have a kinship, even though we have so many different interests and things that I like things neither of them would ever do. They like things I like. They both are real big drinkers. I don't drink at all. Anthony goes shooting all the time, loves guns. I like guns, but I don't go shooting like 4 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever. So we all have such different personalities and interests, but the common unifier is that we all feel drawn to this war, and we feel like it's our job to be out there fighting it and paying whatever price it takes. And so we have had these moments where it's us in the trenches. Like when we're sitting in Chicago 2 hours before showtime and the owner of the venue calls us and says, I have to cancel the show. Like you are in the trenches now with fellow soldiers. And it's like, all right, like, one guy's dejected and he just orders a tray of shots. The other guy's got to pick up the ball and run with it, and so we've really been there for each other in these times. And I think what I like about my friendship with those guys and why I cherish it so much and value it is it's not based on what we have in common or how close we are. I live on the other side of the country from those guys, but it is based on going through those wars together and really like being able to look across at each other and know that like we've fought together, whether we agree about everything, whether we're similar, whether we even like each other at times. All that takes a backseat to the fight.
One last question. I noticed that amongst my son's friend group, that they're in their teens, they like inappropriate humor. They're drawn to it. And it could just be the rebellious nature of youth. But I wonder if you're seeing younger people who are being stereotyped as snowflakes and millennials and Gen Z, and they're all aghast at everything that's going on. Is there an undercurrent as well of younger people saying, hey, screw this. I want outrageous, crazy comedy. I'm sick of being constricted. Any sense of that, or is it hard to tell?
No, you're dead on about that. And it is so interesting to see. And this is one thing, again, this sounds like a Gavin love fest, but it's the truth. One of the things that I think people ignore in their criticisms of Gavin is there's a reason why this guy has been at so many critical junctures of culture in the last 20 years. There's a reason why he was the creative voice at Vice when he was. There's a reason why when he created the Proud Boys, people joined and followed, and then it became this other sort of mutation of what it was originally designed to be. He's very good at predicting the culture of America and knowing the cycles of that. And if you listen to him talk about music, he's like an encyclopedia on music history. He knows so much about so many bands throughout, decades of time across all genres. And he really has his finger on the pulse. And what's amazing is when you come to our shows, Anthony's fans are sort of the crotchety old get off my lawn people, right? Because they listened to him through Opie and Anthony. They've known him for 20 plus years. And that's very much his audience is a reflection of the way he sort of does comedy and the way he broadcasts. What's interesting about Gavin is even though he has some of those same viewpoints and talks about those things, his audience, it's not like people think it's going to be like Proud Boys and white supremacists. It's not. It's young families. It's young couples who have kind of heeded his messaging of like, we need to get back to traditional Western values, the things that made America great in the beginning, hardworking, 2-parent families, having kids at a young age, going through struggle and forging a really meaningful relationship with your husband or your wife. And so we're going out to these shows and we're seeing 21, 22, 23-year-old married couples who are dying to be offended because they've grown up in a world that's so guardrailed for them. And in a weird way, it's like when it's an everybody gets a trophy generation, the idea of like, hey, marry your girlfriend at 21 and have kids, that feels like punk rock to them compared to the lifestyle they grew up in. So in a weird way, like Gavin is sort of leading young culture to be like, you know what the most rebellious thing to do is with your life right now? Take a stand for something and have some responsibility. And people are going, yeah, it's kind of like how they react to Jordan Peterson. It's a little like the application is different and Gavin's a hell of a lot more punk rock and funnier about it. But not to like diss Jordan's comedic chops at all, but in a weird way, they're hitting young people in a meaningful way and kind of leading them away from this woke ideological poison.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it's also refreshing to hear. But Josh, thank you for joining the show. You can see Josh Denny on his End Racism tour. Yes, you'll have to kind of get a drip of information, but it's well worth it. Just go to tinyurl.com/censored live. You'll have all the details there. And if you want more of Josh Denny, check out the Big Time Sports Cities sports show on censored.tv. Another place for outrageous, uncensored material. Kind of like the 90s, kind of like the 80s. Boy, I miss that, and I know you do too. But Josh, stay safe out there. Keep making us laugh, and there are people who appreciate what you're doing. It does matter. I know it's just jokes, but boy, in this culture right now, it's much more than that.
Well, thank you.
All right, it's time for your weekly tip. It's going to be brief, but wanted to share it. Usually I recommend good shows, killer movies, something you want to check out. Doing the opposite here, putting the brakes on. Please just skip Anna Nicole Smith, You Don't Know Me. It's a Netflix documentary, just came out, and it's a clunker. I expected it either to be trashy and guilty pleasure fun, or just really sophisticated, looking at her career, her life, her addictions, how pop culture chewed her up and spit her out, how she was used, how she used other people. It's just a mess. You get a few insights, but it's just not really compelling. You could tell every 10 minutes you could think, oh my gosh, what if they went in this direction? What if they explored that angle? What if they kind of drilled down deeper on this segment of pop culture? None of it happens. I guess it maybe works as a nostalgia piece. You get to recognize maybe this happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. That was interesting. I remember all those things happening, but other than that, not so much, really. Not so much. So, you can say what you want about things like the Tiger King documentary series. It was soapy, it was trashy, I get that. But the team behind it, they were really good at shaping that story, of bringing that narrative together, of putting all the pieces that were necessary to tell that saga. It was very well constructed. I felt none of that watching Anna Nicole Smith, You Don't Know Me, and I recommend you skip it. All right. That's it for this week. Before I let you go, thank you to Radio America. They've been having me be a part of their podcast network for a while now. I really appreciate it. I don't say it nearly enough, too. So thank you. And also, swing by HollywoodInToto.com. It's my website. I update it every day of the week. Lots of new information, reviews, interviews, commentary. It's all there from a right-leaning, freedom-friendly prism, just like this show. See you next time.